In the late spring of 2014, a gathering of 4 companions embraced a cavern jumping undertaking in the local of Costa Brava, Spain. Their objective was the Cove dels Arrays. In spite of its light-hearted moniker, the cavern conveys more foreboding implications. This was a spot they ought to have never entered, yet a longing to investigate the neglected influenced the gathering's perspective. So they chose to proceed their arrangement to enter it. This is their shocking story. Kell's AR case, or Cavern of Coffins, isn't especially huge by submerged cave complex guidelines. Truth be told, it's only 262 FTATM from one finish to another. It has a shockingly straightforward construction too. Its entry is 23 FT or 7M. On a deeper level, the Cove de l'Ar case is well known with experienced jumpers, submerged picture takers, and sea life scientists who appreciate the interesting land highlights and the different untamed life inside and around the cavern. Swimmers and free jumpers incidentally swim down to the cavern's mouth. Also, however, if you feel compelled to wander inside for a few unmistakable reasons, truly Cove de l'Ar case is simply too dim. Nobody truly understands what's happening down there, and it's super unnerving overall. It's not open to general society for security reasons, since individuals have kicked the bucket in there that set a magnet to those need a genuine experience and to investigate the obscure. Jumpers who enter the cavern should initially swim along the floor to move toward roughly 25 FTOR 7. 6M prior to beginning up to a slight rising toward an unmistakable protuberance. At the furthest finish of the protuberance lies a stone-thrown entrance, prompting another huge dull chamber. Guides of the cavern really do exist, however there's no record of anybody truly swimming into that second chamber, obviously. Its size, aspects, and geography are moderately obscure, and throughout the long term it's turned into somewhat of a metropolitan legend. On the morning of Saturday, July 19th, 2014, the sun stimulated the 4 companions as they at last set out on the experience that they had been pondering for some time. They got together through a buckling bunch, yet not a solitary one of them at any point went into any serious caverns, particularly ones that were not investigated and considered lethal. They were truly eager to have a go at something new and stretch their boundaries. Their fervor consistently expanded. As they took a boat over to the cavern, everybody was feeling great. This experience was at long last happening. It took them long stretches of intending to at long last move, all settled up, so this was no joking matter for themselves, and an undertaking that they were wanting to have the option to fill their companions in. About when the excursion was over, they've all plunged along the shoreline of Bravo region. Before yet something that truly gotten them to this cavern, specific from the wide range of various neglected collapses. The world was that this one considers new disclosures to be made. There's researchers that really need to understand what's inside, and they'll work with the jumpers to sort out their best arrangement of methodology for getting in the game and getting out securely. The companions realized that KC plunging was intrinsically dangerous, however. It was the sprinkle of risk that worked everything out, such that appealing and habit-forming, they just couldn't get enough of it, was similar to adrenaline junkies that like to go skydiving or go wingsuit flying. When they showed up close to the Cadel's craft case, Ricard and Denisio, 2 truly old buddies, and they had known one another for quite a long time, and a third unidentified companion, equipped, shared restless looks and slipped into the unmistakable blue water they needed to investigate. And it was occurring in the interim. The 4th companion remained on the boat, and he was the one that, assuming anything turned out badly, he planned to find help to get his companions out. Assuming there was a setback or crisis, he could help them and assist with getting different jumpers nearby and ready specialists if necessary. Right off the bat, Ricard and Denisio and the other jumper got their direction and investigated a couple of the other cavern or collapses the region, after which they ended up toward the front of Cadel's Arrays lowered entrance. They sort of sprung up before them. They could hardly imagine how they were. We're at last here, and going to go into this cavern. Even 23 FD down the daylight entered the water, so much that they really had a solid sense of security. Investigating inside and around the little opening, they weren't in the cavern, yet they were going down to the entry other than not many beams of faint light bobbing around inside. The inside was a prohibiting chasm, with no recognizable structure. They likewise saw that inside the walls were made of like a delicate earth material, and that the floor was canvassed in fine silk. This is an extremely terrible thing for cave jumpers, since, supposing that this sediment stirs up, it blinds them, and they, in a real sense, can't see anything. In such circumstances, jumpers frequently utilize a rule outside the cavern prior to entering. This is by and large a typical practice, yet particularly evident when there's residue on the floor of the cavern. Then, if they lose perceivability or become muddled while inside, they can just follow the rope out anyway. Ricard and Denisio and the third jumper didn't have the rope. Somebody failed to remember it when they were getting together and preparing. This was a serious mix-up. However, they sort of neglected it and progressed forward, confronted with two decisions. The third man understood that he was stuck between a rock and a hard place, and told Ricard and Denisio that he was leaving. He could have done without the way that they failed to remember the rope. He likewise thought it was an impractical notion to go into the cavern with the earth-like walls and the residue on the lower part of the cavern floor. Everything was advising him to leave, and he attempted to persuade Ricard and Denisio that this would be an incredibly risky jump to proceed, and that they ought to not go. As experienced jumpers and long-term companions, they regarded his choice to leave, yet they wouldn't pay attention to what he was talking about. They had full trust in the thing they were doing, and they considered the plunge rope not no joking matter, since they've been in and out of caverns before without utilizing one, and nothing terrible occurred, and so they let their companions know that it would have been okay, and they'll be fine on their own. After all, they realized that paying attention to your gut feelings was no indication of shortcoming. Rard. What's more, Denisio investigated each other, offered a go-ahead, and afterward continued to swim inside. They hadn't come on this experience just to betray the last moment with that. They swam significantly further into the cavern, helped by their spotlights, and consoled by the noticeable entrance behind them. They covered the initial 115 feet, or 35 m. No sweat. It was wonderful inside, and things were amazing. The sediment wasn't coming up the dirt-like walls, weren't creating any issues, and they may as yet see some of the daylight looking down into the cavern. Yet with each foot they acquired their hearts thump all the more quickly, with the murkiness turning out to be increasingly more outright. It was only frightful inside, and they continued to think this way and that at one another, similar to, are we going to continue onward or simply abandon this entire excursion altogether? Yet they just continued to go. Then, when they ventured out to in excess of 260 feet, or 61 m, into the cavern, they all the while arrived at similar resolution. They enticed blur enough for one day, and they truly needed to get out of there. They knew that assuming anything turned out badly, regardless of whether the littlest measure of sill came up into their way, there would be an exceptionally remote possibility that they could get out. Now it was the ideal opportunity for them to go to the surface anyway. They had been so aim on what was in front of them that they neglected to understand that their balances had fomented a thick layer of sediment on the cavern floor, and presently, as they went to go, they could scarcely make out their hands, only a couple of feet before their countenances. This was their most dreaded fear. They attempted to get one another, however there was nothing there more terrible. Yet the abrupt change in water lucidity had made them lose their internal compass, and with no rope or apparent markers to direct them, they had absolutely not a chance of knowing where they came in. They could have recently headed down any path, and it most likely would have recently driven them further down into the cavern, which is where they would run out of air and pass on. Then it hit Denisio he could swim around for quite a long time, and never track down the entry in the wake of looking around for quite a while. The air in their tanks began to get hazardously low. The two of them knew that hanging tight for the sill to settle was impossible choice. It could take perhaps hours yet now and again. Days or weeks they'd essentially be holding up to their demises, and doubtlessly they'd run out of air before the water cleared. It would be simple for them to stand by, yet it's anything but a choice. Then when it seemed like everything trust was lost, a thin beam of light pierced into the obscurity above them, and Denisio thought in this climate it must be daylight driven by franticness and the will to live. They swam towards it as they moved toward the lake, up increasingly bright and, surprisingly, more encouraging. The break was a lot bigger than they initially had suspected. As a matter of fact, it was somewhat more extensive than their bodies. This was a supernatural occurrence that won't ever occur. At the point when you cave jump, they swam up and into the break, trusting that by some fortunate turn of events, it would extend and at last lead them to the surface anyway. The further they went, the smaller this break turned out to be in the end. They thought their advancement would be stopped altogether as the walls started squeezing them firmly against their backs, chests, and arms. In the meantime, they began to feel like they were never going to escape this break and pass on caught, and it looked progressively probable, like they had stalled out or come to a dead end, and they would run out of air and die in some horrible, nightmarish way. Heaving in the haziness, phenomenally, the section stayed sufficiently wide for them to just barely get through. They continued winding their direction through bending their body as they went endlessly further into the break. Some way or another they did ultimately get through, yet when they did, they were in an altogether unique piece of the cavern that they were not expecting. At first, they didn't know what was happening. However, at that point they understood. They broke into another cavern that was running lined up with the Kel's Array's cave. Their heads, shoulders, and arms were 11 in 1/2T air pocket, caught at the highest point of a lowered cave. Promptly perceiving their favorable luck, they eliminated their hardware and took in the air. Denisio gave a sickening shift focus over to Ricard on the grounds that he realized that there could be carbon dioxide in the air, and it could simply kill them, yet they lucked out, and there was a sufficient blend of air that they had the option to inhale regularly, with their lungs loaded up with air. A gigantic adrenaline rush came over them. Ricard and Denisio felt like they had recently beaten the grave at the 9th hour. They even took photos inside this little air pocket, since they were so blissful and needed to recollect it, for when they got out now, they pondered internally. All they expected to do was hold on and hang tight for their companions, and the salvage jumpers to appear and save them. In the interim, beyond the cavern, Ricard and Denisio's companions has said something was off base and called crisis administrations at 11:00 a.m. Fortunately, officials from Spain's respectful watchmen, or on the other hand, gas, were at that point on the job watching out for the swimmers and jumpers in the space. This was simply one more godsend for them. Group pioneer Corporal Fernando Aguirre quickly started coordinating a salvage party that he trusted would have the option to get in the water by late evening or afternoon, since he realized the salvage would be testing and possibly hazardous. He likewise actuated the common watchman public plunging bunch. Moreover, he enrolled help from sea life scholars, submerged photographic artists, private plunge focuses, and lobster anglers to figure out what they knew about the Cove del Arets, on the grounds that there's simply not much of data on it, and he didn't know anything about it specifically. Sadly, they couldn't give him considerably more data than he previously had, which was fundamentally nothing. One scientist gave a problematic guide, yet it didn't go that far, and it finished in the pungent sinkhole where Ricard and Denisio had disappeared. Corporal Gary and his group were somewhat sure that Ricard and Denisio were someplace inside the cavern, yet they knew from first-hand experience that most snare jumpers don't live extremely lengthy. He was trusting they were in an air pocket. However, on the off chance that that wasn't true, There was no way of saving them, so they were almost certain that they would have been doing a body recuperation in the meantime actually caught in that air pocket. Ricard and Denisio didn't know how long the air sinkhole would wait, or when the salvage activity would start off. There was a restricted measure of air that they could inhale, and after that, they would gradually begin stifling inclination, their lungs exceptionally weighty, and afterward, at last choke in a brutal touch of destiny. The demonstration of them breathing was gradually killing them. As they breathed in and breathed out, the air in the sinkhole was being supplanted via carbon dioxide, and this poisonous result was harming their all-around focused on bodies. To exacerbate the situation, they were experiencing difficulty clutching the cave's smooth walls. This implied that they needed to stay afloat in light of the fact that the base was 24 down, and there weren't any edges to sit or remain on. This consistent effort expanded their pulses in breathing, which thus accelerated the physical and mental impacts of the carbon dioxide harming they were starting to encounter. As the experience delayed for what probably appeared as though an unfathomable length of time, the young fellows additionally started experiencing lack of hydration, hypothermia, and out despair. Ricard was in more awful shape than Denisio yet, with their circumstance turning out to be more critical continuously. The two of them generally surrender to their terrible destinies. They would have rather not talked. They would have rather not taken a gander at one another. Jay simply needed to be quiet in that cave at last. Ricard could scarcely keep his head above water, and on at least one event he unobtrusively slipped underneath the surface, and each time Denisio gathered all the energy in his depleted body and would pull his companion back up. Anyway, as the hours delayed, the psychological and actual burdens turned out to be a lot to handle, and when Ricard slipped underneath the surface that last time, his companion wasn't able to act the hero. Ricard tragically recently continued sinking, currently alone, shudder in the virus water. Uncertain if a salvage had been sent off, Denisio arrived at the understanding that, like his companion, it was inevitable before he passed on in the cavern of coffins, yet some way or another, he had the option to track down it in himself, to stick on to the cloudy vision of a future where he was once again encompassed by companions, friends, and family, and natural air. Yet unbeknownst to him, Corporal Airy and a group of expert salvage jumpers had been in the water searching for him since 50 p.m. In no time into their pursuit, they were stood up to with an almost impervious mass of residue. Ricard and Denisio had worked up that morning. This was verification that they were in good shape, yet in any event, for experts like Corporal Aguirre and his group, the kick the bucket was loaded with risks. The salvage activity was very risky, and the heroes could have effectively passed on during their hunt. They gained great headway almost immediately, yet in the silty water they had absolutely no chance of knowing what direction the men had headed, where they had wound up, or on the other hand, assuming they were as yet alive. This was one more awful incongruity. The silty water was proof that Ricard and Denisio had passed that way, and yet it darkened them from the very men who they had come to save. It resembled a wall that they were simply not going to have the option to overcome. As night fell, the salvage jumpers returned to the surface. For Denisio, it was that evening of absolute fear, weariness, and misery anyway. The hunt continued early that following morning, and by then many writers were on the scene to get data on the creating story. Experienced jumpers and search and salvage workforce from everywhere the nation had shown up to help, yet most knew that the probability of finding Ricard and Denisio was just about zero. Fortunately, the S had at last settled when the jumpers showed up at the Kells Arrays entrance that morning. Yet prior to entering, they moored a plunge line outside the cavern. They won't misstep the same way that Denisio and Rard made then. As they swam into moderately clear water, they saw the very faint light emission light that Ricard and Denisio had seen the day preceding, putting themselves in the missing men's shoes, they accepted that swimming toward the light would have been their main choice. The principal hero to enter the break found it excessively thin and attempted to turn around. He was worried that he planned to stall out and not have the option to get out, and afterward he understood he was unable to get out. Assuming he attempted to return, so he pushed through with all that he endlessly needed to distort his body, and afterward went on vertical. Lastly entered that Ricard and Denisio had been in clearing the inside with his strong spotlight. He quickly saw Ricard's dead body drifting in his neoprene wetsuit. He expected that he'd track down Denisio's body. Straight away, however, shockingly, he was gripping dubiously to a spiked stone on the most distant side of the sinkhole. When he understood that he was at this point not the only one, he let out a struggled groan that frightened Corpo Giri, and the other salvage jumper Denisio had to some degree figured out how to remain alive under the unimaginable circumstances. Yet he was so depleted, dried out, hypothermic, and bewildered that his endurance was a long way from specific. The way that he was as yet alive was extraordinary. It was what they expected. However, freeing him from the cavern would be one more monstrous test, and getting him out alive wasn't doing great, and even with salvation so close, Denisio wouldn't put on the air tank that they had brought to him. He was simply ridiculous and had no clue about what was happening. He was battling the salvage jumpers and believed that they were attempting to hurt him. He had no clue about that they were there to help him. Corpo Giri understood that Denisio didn't have the foggiest idea about where he was, the manner by which he arrived, or who the heroes were, so he basically wouldn't coordinate, expecting that he'd just answer somebody he knew. Corporal Airy hurriedly got back to the surface and persuaded Denisio's jumping companion who came with him to go with him back into the cavern to save Denisio. He wasn't certain about it yet. He concluded he needed to do it. He knew how hazardous this salvage mission would be for him. Yet it was the main thing that should be possible to save Denisio, so he followed Corporal Aguirre into the cave with some other salvage jumpers and worked his direction down to where that old cave was at. Long last, seeing a cordial and natural face advanced the circumstance, however, by that midday Corporal Airy chose to steady Denisio on the grounds that there was no time left, and he knew it was the main way they built to get him out alive. Then something like 24 hours after he had gone into the cavern, Denisio, at long last, broke the surface, joined by Corporal Airy, the group of salvage jumpers, and his companion. Now that Denisio was completely safe, they needed to return into recuperate Ricard's body. Denisio was the main D in Spain to endure such a mishap, and when the media free for all subsided, Corporal Airy sent off an exhaustive examination to decide why the plunge finished in misfortune. It was amazing that Ricard passed on from carbon dioxide harming, which is otherwise called hypercapnia anyway. Corporal Gur's last report noticed that none of the jumpers had the vital preparation or experience to embrace such a difficult make-a-plunge expansion. They overlooked or were new with essential security insurances, like introducing a plunge line that would have directed them to somewhere safe and secure through the residue-ridden water. Some even called out Denisio for not saving Ricard from suffocating anyway. Corporal Gary's report noticed that he currently saved his companion on numerous occasions, yet that, in the end, he simply needed more solidarity to keep him from suffocating. Denisio at last caused a wonderful recuperation. And that is all there is to it for now. And I to see the value in you watching until the end, a story both captivating and grievous. Absolutely. If you enjoyed the introduction to Unfit Frame, feel free to hit the like button to show your support. Additionally, don't hesitate to leave a comment sharing your thoughts, suggestions, or any specific topics you'd love to see covered on the channel. Your engagement is valued and helps shape the content to better suit the interests of the Unfit Frame community. Thanks for being a part of the journey.